Welcome to the Happy Mindset, episode 119. Today's episode is called Personal Development School. Today I'm joined by Thais Gibson. Thais is the co-founder of Personal Development School. This is a school she set up online to help people with their personal development, with their growth. She primarily helps people with relationship dynamics. So a lot of our courses are formed around attachment theory and understanding of enmeshment trauma as well. These types of concepts and these understandings that can help people move forward in life. She also has got a good understanding of the subconscious mind, so it's not even just relationships. I've seen there's courses as well for people who are more goal-oriented, looking for success in their life. So Thais helps you to understand how your subconscious mind can be the difference between succeeding and not succeeding in your goals and what you're setting out to achieve in the world. So I enjoyed talking to Thais. I really enjoy talking to people about the subconscious mind. And I liked her approach as well. She's got a very diverse way of looking at things. Like myself as well, she's a believer in taking on board different schools of thoughts. She's got a nice way of combining personal growth with more of a strategic and analytical process. So that's the way I'm wired. I'm a person who's very strategic and analytical about things. I'm also open to personal growth. So I enjoy talking to Thais because she combines the two quite nicely, I feel, as well in her school. So I'd recommend checking out her school as well. I learned a lot about relationship dynamics in that school. What I've started to learn more and more is that it's your relationship to yourself that you're really working on here. That'll help you to form more of a secure attachment. So on this episode, we do touch a bit on different types of attachments. I talk about the attachment style that I figured out that I had from taking the quiz online as well from the personal development school, and how that can help you to understand patterns of behavior you have right now and help you to move in a direction that's more secure for you as well and for the people around you. A little bit about enmeshment trauma as well in this episode, so that might be a new concept and might be something that might help you as well. So I know you'll enjoy today's episode. Thanks again for listening, and I'll speak to you soon. Okay, so thanks for joining us today, Thais.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
My pleasure. So my first question is, who are you and what are you doing in the world today?
I like that. So my name is Thais, and I am the co-owner and creator of something called the Personal Development School. And it's basically an online platform with a whole bunch of different courses that range from everything from attachment theory, attachment styles, to boundaries, codependency, enmeshment, subconscious reprogramming, mindset mastery with money, all sorts of different things. And sort of got to this place as a human being by going through my own personal challenges and really struggling to find a way out. And then finally somebody introducing me to principles of the subconscious mind and realizing, oh my goodness, this is why I wasn't experiencing change, is because unless we incorporate the subconscious mind into the process of change, the conscious mind cannot outwill or overpower our subconscious. And so learning about that was so powerful for me and got me into doing a master's degree in transpersonal psychology and over 13 different certifications, and really trying to sort of combine schools of thought and incorporate the subconscious into the process to create different programs for people and heal myself.
Healing yourself. Actually, going back to the beginning there, what sort of struggles were you going through and how did you believe that you could actually, in a way, transcend those problems?
Yeah, so I struggled with addiction. I definitely went through like some, what we would definitely call childhood traumas growing up. And after a knee surgery, I was an athlete and went on to play like Division I soccer and get a scholarship and all these different things. But prior to that whole experience, I had knee surgery and was put on painkillers and just got really addicted very quickly without understanding why, without even really knowing much about what addiction was. And it really scared me. Like I went through my first set of withdrawals before I even knew what withdrawals were from anything. And it kind of set me on this path really young of going, I do not want to live like this. What is going on? Like, this is really scary, and feeling really alone in that because I didn't know a lot of people at that age or time period who were experiencing things like that. And so it was interesting because I had a lot of these moments of going, this is the last time, this is the last one, this is the last, and then feeling like just so much self-loathing and frustration towards myself because it was like I would say that, I would try so hard, I would promise myself, I would write notes about how I'm going to stop these things, and I was just always falling back into the same cycle of like the next day, there I go again, and like just really feeling like I was in this huge battle within myself. And when I learned about the subconscious mind, I realized, oh my God, this is what the battle is. It's my conscious mind wanting one thing and my subconscious mind having a different set of motives to avoid pain. And painkillers were a great way for that to happen, because a lot of things I was carrying that were unresolved emotionally at a subconscious level for me were literally like, okay, you have all this lack of resolution emotionally, you're carrying all this subconsciously stored pain. And of course, painkillers are a great outlet because they help you to kind of numb everything and calm everything and not have to experience that. And so understanding that was like such a pivotal moment for me in my life that was like, okay, now I know. And once I have that understanding, I really went into learning about the subconscious so I could do this work and create that transformation.
What was the time frame like there? How many years were you struggling with your conscious mind, not knowing the unconscious mind, the subconscious?
Yeah, almost 7 years. The better part of it was like 6.5 or so years, but almost daily opiate use, and almost daily, like honestly, like self-loathing and feeling like, what's wrong with me? I can't change this. I'm so weak. I'm helpless to myself. I'm powerless in my life. Like a lot of really self-diminishing thoughts, which of course just fed that cycle really quickly. And that was a really hard thing. Like anybody who's ever struggled with addiction, like especially if you're trying to really get out of it, not when you're in the space of like just subconsciously, oh, enjoying the experience or whatever it is at the time. But when you're really trying to get out of it, like it's a little bit of a tormenting thing for a human being to go through. And so, yeah, so that just meant so much to me when I started learning about that. And, I sort of lucked out. I had like a mentor come into my life by like the grace of God, like just through sort of a miraculous happening that I met somebody, and that person just really started opening me up to different concepts and ideas that were both spiritual about like meditation, and that really helped me to observe the contents of my mind and like observe my thinking, and went into like meditating 3-4 hours a day to try to understand the patterns and really get to the root of things. And then that was combined with a whole bunch of theory and analytical stuff I could really sink my teeth into, so that those two sort of gaps were bridged for me. And that's when I really started learning and being able to transform.
Were you quite like an analytical mind or an analytical person and a spiritual person before you started learning about the subconscious mind, or was that something
Yeah.
that you developed in yourself after that?
Yeah, I was definitely really analytical growing up, and didn't have any like I really kind of thought that belief in like God or spirituality was silly. And that was just because of my conditioning, my programming. And then as I did like a lot of meditation, I just had some really interesting experiences, more just in like synchronicities or like me wondering about something and these things sort of showing up, and just had them happen so frequently that, I don't think that there's like a God, like a little man hanging out in the sky looking down on us, but I kind of think like maybe the ether or energy or those sorts of things might be like, there's a lot of really interesting research by Greg Braden about the God particle and this sort of stuff. And so I definitely believe in something greater than ourselves. And so that definitely opened me up to spirituality. But because I was able to combine that with like specific learnings, then it gave me something that I could really like connect to, because I definitely needed to process like how this actually works and what this is all about and get to like the root level of things. So the combination of those two forces of being able to really self-observe and step outside of like the ego mind from a sort of spiritual perspective, but then also being able to understand what the ego mind is made up of and where it comes from, and that it is just largely our subconscious and the patterns and how these things take place, and being able to bridge those two gaps was like extremely powerful for me.
Did you have a good understanding of meditation when you started it, or did you feel like you were doing it wrong in any way? Or
I honestly, the first time I did it, I know this sounds so funny, but it kind of gave me the same like sensation as like a painkiller experience. Not the same like euphoria, but I think because I knew that the idea of meditation was just to like not think and clear your mind. And I know there's so many different types of meditation, like Vipassana and guided meditations and all these different things, but mine was like just try to focus on not thinking and just try to go into silence for as long as you can. And I think a lot of like what I was trying to escape was, belief imprints that I had from a really young age, and some painful things that happened, and those belief imprints creating a lot of very active internal dialogue because they were touched on quite often. And so having a lot of really painful self-defeating thoughts. And so if we think, research from like the University of Southern California Neuroimaging Institute shows that we think roughly 60 to 70,000 thoughts per day. And a large portion of those are negatively oriented. And the more trauma we have, the larger that portion becomes. And we know that those belief and thought patterns produce emotional reactions, which also create neurochemical balances or imbalances depending on what type of thoughts you're having. And so for me, like a lot of those things were so negative and so like I was so self-critical and so just a lot of pain in there. And so I think painkillers for me kind of slowed that internal dialogue and numbed that. And actually meditation was almost like a replacement for that. Obviously, for different reasons, but just the idea of not thinking and just being able to like disidentify from thought and witness it and not just invest in these stories about myself being unworthy or not enough or all these different things had that same impact of creating peace. And so I sort of latched onto that a little bit, and really got into meditation quite deeply, but was combining that with self-observation and like, what are these patterns of thought? Where do they come from? Understanding the subconscious and sort of being like a scientist of my own mind for a little while. And that was a powerful thing.
Would it be fair to say it was from curiosity that you were asking those questions as well about the patterns of the mind, and rather
Yeah,
than trying to analyze it to death?
I think curiosity, but I also think survival. I think, at the place that I was coming at it from, it created such an intensity around it. And, I was fearful avoidant in my attachment style. And, fearful avoidance can be quite intense with how they explore things. But, I think I felt like I had hit a really big rock bottom at the point where I was introduced to this information and some scary stuff was going on in my life. And it was like, I have to figure this out because I don't see myself really living and going on like this. So it was really fueled by this like tenacity, like almost I'm unsafe unless I figure this out. And so I think that kind of pushed the behavior really strongly to dive really deeply into as well.
Okay. Would that be like an intense open-mindedness then, like, or because sometimes I have an intensity where it feels more just like me getting in the way more so than anything. But I know when I come from an open-minded approach, I'm more likely to find solutions and opportunities and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Like really open-minded, really open to just observing first what was happening within myself and then being able to like accept anything that was there and just be open to seeing all of it so that I could then do something with it.
And do you remember when you started working on the actual beliefs and consciously shifting these thoughts and things that were
Yeah.
causing you pain?
Yeah, I think it started really at the thought level before the beliefs. And something that was really powerful for me when I was meditating one time, and this was sort of a catalyst, is I was meditating and I knew that I was like really beating myself up for stuff. And I just had this sort of recognition that like this is the voice of my father. Like this isn't me and things that I chose. Like I don't want to be speaking to myself this way. These are like programs. Like these are things that this is my father's dialogue to me internalized. And because my dad was really tough and very authoritarian and really pushed me in sports and really gave me a hard time if I made mistakes. And I had really internalized that sort of tenfold. And I was like, oh my goodness. And so from that, I started really observing like how many of these thoughts are thoughts that I would be choosing to have from a conscious perspective in relationship to myself, and how many of these things are just tapes I picked up along the way. And soon after that, I got into cognitive behavioral therapy, which talks a lot more about those belief patterns. And then I did some other trainings that talked about similar things. And I also came across a lady named Byron Katie's work about questioning our thoughts on an ongoing basis. And I had started to do that by realizing that, oh, this is this is the voice of my father, this is the voice of my mother, this is the voice of this coach that I had a hard, whatever it was. And being able to question those thoughts instead of just invest in them and buy into them. And I was basically doing that throughout the course of my day. I sort of learned this mechanism of whenever I felt bad, whenever I felt off, instead of being like, oh, I'm having such a bad day, going like, what have I just been thinking about? How have I been speaking to myself? And really regulating at the thought level first and being able to go like, no, I'm not an unworthy human being. I'm not, and all these stories, and being able to just correct them. And I did that so often. And then we know that repetition plus emotion repatterns the subconscious mind. And so by correcting the way I was thinking so often, obviously that was producing a different emotional output. And I think just because we can really reprogram at the thought or belief level, by reprogramming the thoughts, a lot of those beliefs went away. But I later learned through trainings and different education that, oh, we can just go right to the beliefs and that can even further speed up the process. So I did kind of the heavy lifting, but there's a more simplified way.
Yeah, because you've got belief, thoughts, actions as well. You can change it on an action level as well, can't you?
Yes, absolutely.
What's the low hanging fruit for somebody who's completely like new to this, or they're not really grounded in it yet? Is it best to go to action, thought, or belief, or is there any
Beautiful
recommendation?
question. So I'll give the sort of synopsis, because I know you know a little bit about this. So for somebody who's really unfamiliar and somebody's like, wow, I'm carrying a lot of painful patterns, what we know is that your emotions are always a feedback mechanism, and they're always letting you know when something's out of alignment. So there's no such thing as like emotions being random or just having an off day. Like what's actually happened is one of two things. We either have unmet needs, and those unmet needs are producing an emotional response. And that's great, because that's literally there to help us evolve and grow and change. And if we didn't have negative emotions when we had unmet needs, we wouldn't have sought safety or survival or food or shelter, and we wouldn't have survived as a species. So we have negative emotions being the output of that. And obviously, if you have deeply unmet needs all the time as a person, then you're going to have lots of negative emotions. And your emotions are made up of neurochemical reactions. So then you're going to have more cortisol, more norepinephrine, instead of having more serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin if we have our needs met. And those same exact principles apply to the chain of beliefs. So if we have a lot of painful imprints from childhood, so let's say, let's pretend that you have a parent who is really critical to you all the time, or there's chaos in your home a lot, and maybe you form these interpretations about your environment and really remember them so you can try to navigate it better and keep safe. Maybe those things are like, I'm unsafe, I'm not good enough, I'm unloved, or whatever meaning we give to our experiences. Now, your subconscious stores these really powerfully because it's trying to be able to remember them and protect you from putting yourself in harm's way again. But then what happens as a byproduct of that is those belief patterns produce all these patterns of thought. So if I believe I'm not good enough, or you believe you're not good enough, then we go, oh, I'm not smart enough, I'm not funny enough, I'm not interesting enough. And we have all these extensions that are sort of like tree branches to a tree trunk. And then from that, we also get negative emotions, just like when our needs are unmet, which are also made up of neurochemical reactions. And then neuroscience has proven that every single decision we make is based on emotion. So even people who are like, oh, I'm so rational and I'm so logical, at our tipping point, we're making these emotionally based decisions and just quick to rationalize or justify through logic. So really, we can reprogram at any point. We can reprogram by starting to meet our unmet needs, or you can reprogram through being aware of the belief and thought patterns that we're running on autopilot throughout the day and changing them, or by changing our actions. So an example of changing an action would be if, let's say, I'm terribly afraid of spiders, and let's say I'm trying to just break through that. Or let's say like a more normal one. Let's say somebody's really afraid of talking to people of the opposite sex, and really afraid of like striking up a conversation. And so maybe you would start through action by trying to, go into a room where there's people of the opposite sex and smile at them, and just expose yourself to seeing them through action and taking that action of smiling, and then trying to cognitively like produce positive emotions by going like, hey, I'm okay, I'm safe, it's all good, like nothing bad's happening. And then each day you could incrementally increase that action. So maybe then you say hi to somebody, maybe then you have a conversation, maybe then you ask for a phone number, whatever it is, you warm yourself up through actions. And that's really good for like breakthrough reprogramming for those sorts of situations. But when it comes to like painful beliefs we might be carrying about ourselves, it's always the fastest to just go to the belief itself. Like if you look at it, why am I afraid of talking to people of the opposite sex? Oh, because I believe that I will be rejected. I believe that I'm not good enough. I believe I'm unlovable. If we can reprogram those things that we believe about ourselves, naturally our actions follow. Everything else follows: our thoughts, our emotions, our actions. So that's always the best place to go, because it's really like the root of the problem.
And so I think with the subconscious mind, if we're not getting our needs met, it goes about it in a roundabout way as well. That might be useful to help people with the situations you might find yourself in that might look perplexing on the surface, but it's like an unconscious need that you're getting met through a situation that you might necessarily want on a conscious level. Can you talk a little bit about how the subconscious will get our needs met either way, whether we're conscious of it or not?
Yes, I love this question. Okay, so the subconscious mind is like a needs meeting machine and an association making machine. So we develop different strategies throughout life for how to get our needs met. And this could be, for example, that maybe we're 5 years old, and when we don't feel emotionally connected to or seen, we scream and we throw a temper tantrum. Now, However, you build in positive associations because of something working at the time now becomes a program. So if at 5 years old, when you threw a temper tantrum, mom and dad came and coddled you and gave you candy and rubbed your head, like, then you're like, oh, this works. And unless we actively change that program, that stays alive. And then we see that person, you know, in their 40s in a boardroom meeting, like throwing a temper tantrum because their point's not heard and smacking the table and getting up and making a scene. So what's interesting is that our subconscious mind is always trying to find ways to get needs met. It programs in based on positive versus negative associations, what it sees as working versus not working. And it doesn't change those programs. So sometimes we really have to go back in and like update our strategies, because sometimes we'll have these really outdated strategies and your subconscious isn't concerned with like, let me get my needs met in the best way. It's like, let me get my needs met in the fastest way. So even that guy in this imagined scenario who's, let's say in his 50s, having an adult temper tantrum in the boardroom meeting, his brain goes, check, the box is checked. We got seen, we got heard, we got attention, even though that's like a really counterproductive thing at a conscious level. So when we have painful patterns of behavior and we call them like self-sabotage, we want to recognize that there's no actual such thing as self-sabotage. Everything is just a subconscious strategy to get our needs met in the fastest way possible. And so we have to be able to recognize when we have self-sabotaging patterns, they actually are meeting needs for us subconsciously. And when we can identify what needs those things are by just asking, like, hey, what needs are getting met when I throw a temper tantrum in the boardroom meeting, and then identifying them, that's feedback that those needs are unmet at a grander scale in our lives. And that we have to start updating our strategies and going, okay, how can I get these needs met regularly? How can I get more seen in my life? How can I get more heard in my life? Do I have to express more vulnerably to my loved ones? Do I have to make more space for myself in the boardroom meeting and be patient? Like, what are some updated strategies? And then we can use that experience that's negative and self-sabotaging as feedback to really empower ourselves as a human being.
Yeah, I think with self-sabotage, that can be quite disempowering. It feels like a victim rather than what you're saying there. When you start seeing that your unconscious mind, your subconscious is getting other needs met, you can go directly to that and see like how are you benefiting in a way that you didn't know you're benefiting from the current situation. I like that. Puts the power back in your own hands again. Another thing that I learned a bit from you is like enmeshment. Can you talk a bit about enmeshment and how that can influence our relationships when we grow up as well, like the impact it can have?
Yeah, so enmeshment is such a common thing that's like very underrated in terms of its impact. So when we talk about like, you know, people have different attachment styles, and we won't go into that too much just yet, but often the individuals who experience the most enmeshment are fearful avoidance and anxious preoccupied. And these are different insecure attachment styles because of some of the impact that enmeshment can have. So really what enmeshment is basically a parent or caregiver giving love or expressing love to a child in a way that's boundaryless and in a way that teaches that, hey, you're responsible for my feelings and I'm responsible for yours. And even though that can seem like, oh, what a sweet, endearing thing, what it really is creating is codependency, beliefs that we are responsible for people in ways that we're not, which creates a lot of helplessness in the human psyche. Because if, let's say, somebody has a parent who's an addict and we really want to help them, really at the end of the day, like, we can't change another person. And so we're constantly going to feel a sense of self-defeat. And just because of the idea that we are responsible for other people. And then when we don't have boundaries, it's like the perfect recipe to create resentment in a relationship, because wherever there's a perceived imbalance for space, time, energy, or matter between two people, that's what conflict is made from. So if we are giving in a boundaryless way, and we're not able to have boundaries or express needs or identify our sense of self so we can receive back, we're always going to feel some kind of resentment in that relationship dynamic. And that can lead to emotional volatility, toxicity, anger, all sorts of things that come out of us just as a byproduct of not having boundaries and not really knowing what boundaries are. And that's essentially what enmeshment teaches.
I get it. Like, I think only until recently, I didn't have any language around mental and emotional boundaries. I didn't have that concept. I didn't even know that was a thing that was impacting how I was feeling and how I was interacting as well, engaging. I'm guessing some of this can be intergenerational as well, like where there was never a concept of this. And so you don't know what damage you're doing because you are completely unconscious to it.
100%. Like, I think a lot of people who love through an enmeshed dynamic, that's how they were loved. And so that's all they know how to share with others. And so, when we talk about boundaries too, so many people, like you mentioned, like don't have the language for boundaries because nobody's teaching this stuff in like the mainstream too often. So we have to know, like, what our boundaries are. We have different types. We have our mental boundaries, like you said, which are really your thoughts, opinions, those sorts of things. Our emotional boundaries, which is like how much of other people's emotions are we taking on and making ours or our responsibility, instead of being able to show up for somebody, hold space for them, but then say, tell me what you need and I can see if that works from my end, instead of just feeling like, they're in pain, I have to fix or save them. And there's a really big difference there in terms of how we interact. And then we have our time boundaries, like knowing what to say yes or no to based on our own time. The example I often give is like, if you have a neighbor who's like, hey, let me, come help me move, or hey, can you drive me to the airport? And you have to pull an all-nighter at work. Some people won't have, not that anybody should be pulling all-nighters at work, but um, a lot of people just think they operate under this belief that I can't say no. So they give their time, and then how do you think they feel going to Bob's house to help him move? Well, super resentful and not very happy to be there. And if we don't respect our boundaries, we go into dynamics resentful, and it just creates more toxicity long term. And then we have our material, physical, sexual boundaries. And obviously those are more self-explanatory, but if we don't know what those are, and if we don't know what they are in the 7 areas of our lives, then we go into everything from sort of this like limited perspective.
Like I've experienced that a lot with like helping. I felt like I couldn't say no, and I'd feel the resentment while I was helping, and then I'd feel bad about myself for being a bad person for resenting. What I've tended to do now, since I've become more aware of this stuff, is first of all just feel it, because I don't even know how to react. I've been so long in this pattern. I'm feeling it, so I can just feel what's going on for me, acknowledge that I feel resentful, not even judge myself then for being resentful. I'm just leaving it there, and then I work through the thoughts again some other time. Do you have any advice for somebody who might, like me, have been 30 years in a pattern without knowing they're in that pattern to begin with?
Absolutely. So I love what you said. So you've recognized the pattern, which is amazing. And then the tangible steps are actually this. It's okay, I can see what I'm feeling and I'm using my feelings as feedback. And then you ask yourself, okay, so what do I need right now? And then what's my healthiest strategy for communicating or getting this need met? And so like if you're, let's say you go into a dynamic, and this is extremely common amongst people, to go into a dynamic boundaryless, not know that I didn't have boundaries, go and feel the resentment. It's also very common that people then feel bad for feeling the resentment, and that vicious cycle continues. But you can be in that space, and then you can go, whoa, I'm feeling resentful right now. Like, this is not serving the dynamic. So what do I need to feel better or to feel relief? And then maybe let's say you're at Bob's house moving, and you have so many things to do and you can't afford to be there. You might ask yourself, okay, wow, I'm realizing really strongly that I need to get out of this dynamic. And then you might ask yourself, okay, so like, how can I communicate that effectively? And then maybe I just go to Bob and I say, hey, I really wish I could be here longer to help you, but I'm noticing that I'm feeling a bit stressed because I have so many things going on, and I can stay for another 15 minutes, but then I really have to leave, or whatever it is. But if we don't do that, then we just get angry at Bob. We never want to talk to Bob again after that day. We push Bob away, like all these things. And when we can just sort of trace those feelings backwards and ask, what do we need? How can we communicate? That usually produces a solution in those sorts of dynamics where we feel resentful and we're not showing up for our boundaries.
Yeah, because in the long run, I think it hit home for me that that relationship just deteriorates over time, because the resentful is just bills and bills, and yeah, it's not a great thing.
100%.
Do you have actually any advice for art? Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, just one other thing, it's a really powerful process. Like anywhere you have resentment and you notice yourself pulling away, for any human being, like it's so important to be able to ask yourself, okay, what do I need to feel relief? And what's my strategy for doing this, and how can I communicate it? And as long as we do that in every situation, we start to have really empowering relationships, because when we don't set boundaries, one of the natural byproducts of it is that we feel unseen and unheard and misunderstood as human beings, or we don't feel loved for who we truly are because we're not truly showing ourselves. Like if I don't express my needs, express my boundaries, nobody's seeing me. And then we usually feel like a byproduct, oh, like I'm unloved, nobody really cares about me. And we tell all these stories and give it all this meaning, but it's actually a reflection of us not loving and caring about ourselves strongly enough. And then we take that, we give that meaning, and we project it onto the people around us, but it's actually our work to do.
Yeah. The other thing actually I've noticed is that when I don't have the boundaries, I tend to play a role more automatically. I tend to show up as the role that I think that person expects me to be when I'm not paying attention to the emotion. I think what's helping me is I'm starting to see that resentment or any emotion as inner guidance, that this is signaling to me that there's something off balance here. And yeah, it just makes me more aware of like just the role I'm playing there. Because again, I feel resentful as well when I'm in a role where I feel like I need to be in a role as well to be accepted by somebody. And then it comes back to the problem, I don't feel seen and heard for who I actually am then.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. And that sucks. Like that's not a fun thing in
yeah,
relationships. And they always feel one-sided. And wherever we don't express needs and share our boundaries, I like to say to people like you're building invisible walls between yourself and somebody else because you're not allowing yourself to fully get seen. And there's a lack of vulnerability that comes with that. And playing a role is like when we love or give love through a mask. And then we get into this dynamic where it's like our relationships can even become less fulfilling than they actually have the potential to be.
yeah. Because I think you can lose a sense of what real connection is as well. You can think that this thing is connection, but it actually isn't, which isn't
100%.
great. Yeah.
100%.
Do you have any advice actually for somebody? Because I think actually going back to childhood is quite important. People seem to differ on that, but there's a lot of subconscious patterns that are created there. I think most of them are created there because you don't have a conscious mind until you're about 6 years old or so. But do you have any advice for somebody who wants to go back there again, but they fear that they'll judge their parents and when they start seeing where these beliefs are coming from sometimes as well?
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful things we can do as human beings is to go back into childhood and just get clear about like what imprints we picked up. Because that, like you said, like in our early stages, especially our mind up until really the age of 8 is only producing mostly producing alpha and theta brainwaves, which are like the brainwaves we need to be hypnotized. So usually we go through life and we're actually like basically in a state of hypnosis our first 8 or so years, and this is where most of our deepest programming comes from. And usually we see the world after that point through that lens, through that filter. So like if I believe that I'm not good enough at an early age, unless something actively shifts that for me by some sort of miraculous experience, usually I keep building that filter in further because I keep telling that story, fearing that thing, repeating that internal dialogue. So usually I'm just hardening these early programs over time. And we don't have to go back through and know every single memory or every single thing, but we want to have an idea of like, what did we pick up? What have we been carrying this whole time? And then how can we work to reprogram that? And one of the fastest ways to do this is to just go through like major areas of life and ask yourself like what are my beliefs or what are my pain points that I'm not over, that I still feel something about, because again, your feelings will always be your guide, like you said. And what do I still feel something about on the topics of mom? You know, what am I still feeling a little frustration towards around mom? Or what did mom do that I really like feel resistance about? What about dad? What about siblings? What about teachers? What about people in my early life in general? Like, and really sort of being able to identify these pieces. And then you can take that outwards and look at what painful ideas am I carrying about myself in the 7 areas of my life, in my career, around money, around relationships as a whole, romantically, around mental, my learning capacities or capabilities, emotions, what it means to have emotions, to express them, to share them, spirituality, and then my physical self. And really by like defining those different areas and looking into them, you start to get an idea of this whole like paradigm of your subconscious that you're literally seeing your world through. And once you've isolated the things that feel bad, now you can do the work to reprogram them and clean that stuff up.
Mhm. And so when you mentioned about the hypnotizing there for the first part, we talked a little bit before the podcast why hypnosis, it can have an effect in the short term, but if you're not conscious with things in the long term, it mightn't have the impact that you might have hoped. Why is that?
Yeah, yeah. So basically, what you and I were sort of chatting about was the fact that like sometimes we'll see people go and do hypnosis and get hypnotized, and it can create these really short-term breakthroughs that are powerful. But because it takes a little while for us to fire and wire in new neural pathways and for them to really solidify, and research says it's like 68 days if you are doing it, if you want to make it all the way unconscious, like from conscious to subconscious to sort of the more deep parts of the unconscious mind. And and we have to wait for these old neural pathways to also atrophy that we're trying to replace. So let's say I'm trying to say I am good enough and I'm not good enough. For us to actually naturally start relying on this new one, we have to have this hardening of those neural pathways. And so what can happen is we can go to get hypnotized and go to, do hypnosis. And then think, oh, I feel great now. Like I got rid of that thing. But unless we fire and wire that in and follow that up with post-hypnotic suggestions that are repeating those new things that we're trying to pattern in, then we just sort of go through this little peak of a high, and then we just return back to that normal space. So it takes work to do these things. But I also tell people too, like in the grand scheme of life, the fact that it only takes a matter of a few weeks to change an entire paradigm that you might have been carrying for decades that's been really painful is a miracle. Like it's a really powerful, beautiful thing. So as long as people are committed to doing some daily repetition around stuff that they're trying to work through and really trying to feel more emotions around it, we can see transformation occur quite quickly.
Yeah. No, the schools are taught as well. When did you start realizing that you wanted like a multifaceted approach to this? That you explored lots of different things rather than just sticking at one thing for good?
Yeah, I think because I have a high need for novelty to a certain degree. I think that was sort of my fearful avoidant nature. And I think that I guess nurture technically, but I think that I also just hungered so much for like learning. And I was having really powerful awarenesses through different spiritual teachings and spiritual books and different practices. But that didn't like, I needed to know how this translates in a practical format over here because of sort of my analytical nature. And so I was really trying to like combine like spirituality with psychology and science and trying to like get a grasp on all of that. And so different things that were impacting me from like a spiritual perspective, like let's say meditation and disidentifying from feelings and observing them more. I didn't want to be like, what if disidentifying from feelings and observing them is repression? And I went on to learn, no, that's actually the first time we're being fully present with ourselves and really seeing ourselves. But I needed to have those like practical concepts to understand and sort of bridge those two gaps. So everything I learned spiritually, which was sort of the information I was like hungering after originally, I would then try to find a certification or a course that could translate that into practical terms. And so that's where all those different certifications came about, because I was able to sort of bring those two things together.
Did you ever go through any spiritual bypassing at any stage as well, where like you because I went through this where I didn't really know that it would have been repressing feelings, I guess, would have been, but then thinking that I knew more than I knew or something. It was a weird kind of thing. Do you ever go through that, spiritual bypassing?
Absolutely. I think I learned that lesson the hard way, as with most of the things I think I learned in my life. But I originally, like as I was sharing with you before, like as we were pre-chatting, I originally had this point in my life where I was like, oh, I'm going to go live in an ashram and I'm just going to like, live that sort of, that very secluded spiritual life, because I was having such sort of profound breakthroughs there. But that went on to, merge into sort of a different direction. And I very quickly realized that I was navigating the world trying to be egoless, trying to like disidentify from all my patterns and let go of the ego mind. And the natural byproduct of that was I had no boundaries. Like I was like, the I does not exist. And so I was like working the craziest hours, saying yes to anybody who needed help, because I had sort of started this practice and all these people were coming in very quickly. And I was like thinking, oh, I'm fine because I'm healed and I need to help everybody else. And then I actually had like a big health scare. And I was like, this is not the way. Like I was not feeling good on a regular basis. And that's when I went really into studying like the basic, like our needs and our needs system, and really identifying the ego and sense of self. And I realized like, it's not one thing or the other. We're not here to like kill off a part of ourselves that naturally exists. We're here to reprogram the parts of ourselves that don't serve and that are rooted in trauma and that we took from trauma. But we're not here to be like these needless human beings that are just supposed to only ever show up for everybody else. Because if we don't take ourselves into consideration and treat ourselves equally to the way that we treat others, then there is no such thing as like oneness in the first place, because you don't exist in that equation. And so these people who are searching out that, we have to just also learn that, hey, I exist equally and I have to take myself into consideration. And what myself is my needs, is my boundaries, is my desires. And I don't have to over attach to those things and project them onto everything. I just have to be aware of what they are and take them into consideration in my decision-making process as a person.
And from listening to actually, what I think what it was for me was I'd noticed the general patterns, and then as well, it was the body doesn't lie. My body was actually stressed out. I was having jaw problems, having different things, and I was still ignoring that. I was like, no, it's fine. But But then as well, it was that I couldn't translate these universal principles into practical normal language. I wasn't shown that. And as well, I suppose there was more of a vulnerability in self-expressing and actually being me, the individual, rather than a general all-encompassing principle kind of thing, now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, it's
It
such a
sounds so weird.
powerful lesson. It's like, because, I think when people open up to like the world of spirituality, there's so many powerful things in there, but it's really like I think of it too from the perspective of I think it was in like one of Eckhart Tolle's books that I read once, and he said like we're human beings, like we're here to have the human side, like the physical side, the ego side to a certain degree, and the being side, the spiritual aspect. We're not here to like kill off one or the other. We're here to like integrate the two. And so I think that's a really important part of being a human and having our experience here.
There's also like, maybe there's also an aspect of the subconscious not wanting to process certain traumas as well, keeping them hidden, that I'm healed now and stuff. Because, yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? I think the subconscious can hide stuff from us as well, or the brain can lie to us and hide stuff from plain sight as well a lot of the time.
I think sometimes like some of our greatest traumas are the most repressed. So we can have experiences, let's say myself as being fearful avoidant, or if you've experienced anything related to fearful avoidance, like that attachment style is largely one of the big characteristics in it is like, oh, I can't exist. I have to just keep really on guard with everything in my environment because of the chaos or the scariness of it. And like my caregivers aren't okay. And so I have to take care of them and not have boundaries. And so we learn that I am safe when I hyper caretake for others and totally ignore myself. And so I think part of like the adaptation to that trauma is to ignore and repress the sense of self. And so I think that's a big part of where that can come from, is that we think that we have to stay safe by doing that. So sometimes I think spirituality and spiritual bypassing are like, oh, this is exactly what I like and what I'm used to and what I'm familiar with. It gives me healing tools on one side, but I still get to stay safe on the other. And so usually the methods we're using as human beings to stay safe, and that's why it's so important to go back and reflect on childhood, like what did I learn to do to keep me safe? Usually those are the things that we are hiding from ourselves the most because they're most rooted in our survival and our safety. And so why would we be willing to look at them? And that's usually where we see the most growth is coming out and recognizing those components.
Yeah. Actually, the other thing is the relating to other people as well. That's the hard part as well. That's the work there as well in relationship. Actually, so your style is fearful avoidant. What was fearful avoidant? Mine, when I did your test, was fearful avoidant. I'm working through that. But you can get to a place of secure attachment. Can you describe what that is, and as well, like what sort of time frame could you expect? I know everybody's individual. What's we talking years, months, or what's the?
Yeah, great question. So the securely attached person, for I guess like any of your listeners who might not know, is the person who has secure relationships, healthy patterns of relating, feels confident about expressing their feelings and needs, and has less or less painful, usually a combination of both, like not as many and less intense belief patterns about themselves. And usually this is because the rules they were taught for relating in childhood were safe and secure, and they felt they could trust, and there was consistency, and so they naturally produce the rules they learned for relating are good and healthy. And so that's where we're trying to sort of get as human beings. And then most people didn't grow up in that childhood, and different statistics are different, but a lot of attachment styles are self-reporting, and so the information could be a little bit skewed there. But basically we have 3 insecure attachment styles, and this is our dismissive avoidant, our anxious preoccupied, and our fearful avoidant. And anxious individuals usually have some kind of inconsistency in childhood, where they feel like maybe one parent's warm and one parent's cold, or maybe they feel like both parents are really loving, but they both work a lot. But basically any inconsistency creates this dynamic in the subconscious of this individual where it says, okay, I can have closeness with somebody and it feels good, and I build in positive emotional associations to that. But when that's not there, I feel afraid and I feel alone and I feel like I might be being abandoned and I feel unsafe as a result. And so this creates a lot of the anxious preoccupied attachment style. And then they go on in their adult lives to be the people who sort of present as sometimes like needy or clingy or call many times. And, it's actually a trauma response the person's usually experiencing when that happens. And then on the other side, there's the dismissive avoidant who, tends to need a lot of space, and usually they were quite emotionally neglected in childhood. So their patterns for relating are like, well, not going to rely on anybody else to work on my feelings or show up and make me feel secure and safe. I'm just going to self-soothe. And in fact, vulnerability is really not fun, and I don't like it, and it doesn't feel good. And so they build in all these negative associations emotionally to those ways of relating. And then fearful avoidants have that sort of middle ground where they tend to experience both sides of the continuum of feeling anxious sometimes and afraid of abandonment, but also feeling like, oh my gosh, I need space, and vulnerability is unsafe, and sometimes inner shame, like, oh, something's wrong with me. And so they sort of have the core wounds combined with distrust, because usually there's more trauma for the fearful avoidant in their childhood. And so they become really hypervigilant and struggle to trust. And so that's sort of the attachment spectrum there. Now, different people will say different things, but in the experience I've had working in practice and working with students in the school, the average dynamic of somebody who's really doing the work and they're invested, just like taking courses, things like that, usually 3 months, people are like, I am identifying as secure. And this is if they're doing, a few key things are really required. It's, am I reprogramming my core beliefs? Am I expressing my needs and identifying them? Am I not projecting expectations and telling stories, but regulating those things? And am I allowing myself to really, truly feel my feelings and recognize that they're feedback, and see what they're telling me about either my painful beliefs or my unmet needs, and then tend to those things? And if people are really showing up in those 4 areas, usually by 3 months, it's not just like, I'm starting to feel secure. It's like, no, I'm trusting that I'm going to stay secure permanently. But those are people doing, like pretty much daily work for 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, and showing up. But it's, I think, one of the most freeing, I've done this firsthand. It was one of the most freeing, rewarding, important things I ever did. So the daily work is worth it.
Yeah, no, I've done some of your courses there, and I've been like doing it for the last few weeks. What I found is that the emotion starts to loosen a bit, so you're less restrictive in those moments where it felt like this was your personality style rather than it being like a belief you had about yourself and the dynamic. So I like that. Another question that occurs to me, like with all the work you've done on understanding the subconscious mind, does it help you to learn things better in general when you look at patterns and stuff?
I think so, big time. I think maybe not from the same, patterns, yes. I think actually finding patterns is like so much of the good side of fearful avoidant, because you're so hyper vigilant, you like notice all the details to everything. So it almost like I attribute that more to that. But I think the biggest thing that helps about doing subconscious reprogramming is like what I noticed and what I see in other people as human beings is like, we give so much of the real estate in our brain to junk, to like, I'm not good enough, I did this wrong, I'm unworthy, this person doesn't like me. Like, we give so much friggin' energy, and it's because the subconscious hangs on to negative more than positive to try to remember and keep us safe. But it's like extremely dysfunctional from an emotional perspective. And so when you don't have like so much of the landscape of your subconscious mind taken up by garbage, by just like old stories, scary stories, projections, expectations, resentments, like all these things, when you free up all that space, just as a natural byproduct, you feel way better. But then you have more real estate in your mind to take things in and to be present and to really hear things and to make sense of things without trying to interpret information and then go, oh my gosh, I'm not good enough, I'll never learn that. Like, we get rid of all that sabotage stuff, and it just frees up so much of the emotional real estate in your mind for what you want to create.
I get that. Yeah. I think you're more receptive to new concepts, new ideas. You don't have to like check in with yourself this all the time and judging things. And yeah, I think you feel generally lighter as well. And you feel, I guess it turns learning into more of an adventure, an exploration, rather than something you are feeling like you're always examined on and interrogated with.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's it, Thais. Thanks very much. It was great talking to you. I could talk to you all day about this stuff. I'm fascinated with the unconscious, learning more about relationship styles as well. I knew nothing about this maybe a month or so ago. So I'm glad I came across your school. How would people find you online if they're interested in the conversation today?
So you can go to personaldevelopmentschool.com. There's an attachment style quiz on there that people can take, and it comes with like a 1-page report and little videos to learn a little bit more. And then in the actual school part, we have over 30 different pre-recorded courses. And we have 100 plus pre-recorded webinars and on all these different topics and reprogramming and what the subconscious is and does, and then all the different attachment style, boundary, enmeshment courses as well.
Perfect. Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Thais. Thanks for
Thank
taking
you
the time.
so much for having me. This was so much fun.
My pleasure. So until next time, have fun and enjoy the process.